Welcome to Saints and Feasts of the Catholic Calendar, meeting the greatest men and women who have ever lived. February 6th, St. Paul, Miki and Companions, Martyrs, late 16th century. Patron saints of Japan. Native Japanese die to gain the pearl of great price. The words of the American poet John Greenleaf Whittier capture the pathos of today's memorial. For of all sad words of tongue or pen, the saddest are these, it might have been. The swift rise and sudden fall of Catholicism in Japan is one of the great might have beens in human history. Portuguese and Spanish priests, mostly Jesuits and Franciscans, brought the Catholic religion to the highly cultured island of Japan in the late 1500s with great success. Tens of thousands of people converted. 2 seminaries were opened. Native Japanese were ordained as priests, and Japan ceased to be mission territory, being elevated to a diocese. But the rising arc of missionary success just as quickly curved downward. In waves of persecutions from the 1590s through the 1640s, thousands of Catholics were persecuted, tortured, and executed, until the Catholic religion, and indeed any outward expression of Christianity, was totally eradicated. Japan almost became a Catholic nation, coming close to joining the Philippines as the only thoroughly Catholic society in Asia. Japan might have done for Asia in the 1600s what Ireland did for Europe in the early Middle Ages. It could have sent scholars, monks, and missionary priests to convert nations far larger than itself, including China. It was not to be. Paul Miki was a native Japanese who became a Jesuit. The Jesuits would not accept into their seminary men from India or other nations who they felt were of inferior education. But the Jesuits had immense respect for the Japanese, whose culture was equal to or even exceeded that of Western Europe. Paul Miki was among those who, after being educated in the faith, evangelized their own people in their own language. He and others blazed a new pathway forward, allowing the Japanese to not only understand but to see in flesh and blood that they could retain the best of their native culture while being faithful to the newfound God of Jesus Christ. Paul, a Jesuit brother, and his companions were the first group to suffer mass martyrdom in Japan. A military leader and advisor to the emperor feared Spanish and Portuguese conquest of the island and ordered the arrest of 6 Franciscan priests and brothers, 3 Japanese Jesuits, 16 other Japanese, and 1 Korean. The captured had their left ears mutilated and were then forced to march bloodied hundreds of miles to Nagasaki. On February 5, 1597, Paul and his companions were bound to crosses on a hill, like Christ, and pierced with lances. An eyewitness described the scene. Our brother Paul Miki saw himself standing in the noblest pulpit he had ever filled. To his congregation he began by proclaiming himself a Japanese and a Jesuit. My religion teaches me to pardon my enemies and all who have offended me. I do gladly pardon the emperor and all who have sought my death. I beg them to seek baptism and be Christians themselves. Then he looked at his comrades and began to encourage them in their final struggle. Then, according to Japanese custom, the 4 executioners began to unsheath their spears. The executioners killed them one by one. 1 thrust of the spear, then a second blow. It was over in a short time. The executions did nothing to stop the church. Persecution only fanned the flames of faith. By 1614, about 300,000 Japanese were Catholics. More intense persecutions followed until Japan's leaders sealed off their ports and borders from virtually all foreign penetration, a policy that lasted until the 19th century. Only in 1854 was Japan forcibly open to foreign trade and Western visitors. Then, thousands of Japanese Catholics suddenly came out of hiding, mostly near Nagasaki. They bore the names of the Japanese martyrs, spoke some Latin and Portuguese, asked their new guests for statues of Jesus and Mary, and sought to verify if a French priest was legitimate with 2 questions. 1, are you celibate? And 2, do you come from the Pope in Rome? These hidden Christians also opened their fists to show the priests something else, relics of the martyrs, who their remote ancestors had honored centuries before. Their memory had never died. St. Paul Miki, you accepted martyrdom rather than abandon your faith. You chose to serve those closest to you rather than to flee. May we too know, love, and serve God in the heroic fashion that made you so brave and composed in the face of intense suffering. Amen.
Et benedicta fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Well, I first learned about St. Paul Miki and the Japanese martyrs as a Franciscan because we celebrated in the Franciscan calendar as St. Peter Baptist and companions, because some of the companions of St. Paul Miki were Franciscans, with St. Peter Baptist being the head of the Franciscan mission to Japan. And he was sent there by the King of Spain because he was a great man of learning and a great a diplomat on behalf of the king and he was so effective that he gave the warlord gave him permission to build churches, and the Franciscans were very popular and very successful in working with the poor. And of course, one of the first to convert and to become a Catholic was St. Paul Miki, who was one of the native Japanese clergy. He was a Jesuit brother. I don't think he was ordained yet. And someone sowed doubt or suspicion about the Catholic missionaries in Japan. Some believe it was an anti-Catholic Protestant. I know that later on there was a William Adams who did a lot to sow animosity towards the Catholics, because he came there, got shipwrecked, and he turned the warlord against the Catholic missionaries, told them they were spies and that they were there to undermine his authority and prepare them for an invasion. So that's why he became very suspicious and thought that the Catholic missionaries and Catholics were there to overthrow his power. So that's why he rounded up St. Peter Baptist, St. Paul Miki, and about 24 other Catholics, both Japanese lay people who were third order Franciscan, and some were, there was like, the youngest was St. Paul Ibaraki, I think he was. He was only 12 years old. He went because his father was being taken away, and he said, "I want to come with you, Father." So they took him too, and they had to march almost 400 miles from the north, where around present-day Kyoto, all the way down to Nagasaki, where they were going to be martyred. And as they paraded them from the north to the south, it was winter time, because February is winter there. They had to walk through the snow, and every village that they came, they had a man carrying a sign that said, "These people are being condemned for being Christians." And they would be paraded through the towns as a way of trying to discourage anybody from adopting the religion of Catholicism. And so when they finally made their way to Nagasaki, they took them to Nishizaka Hill, where they had 26 crosses prepared. And they put each one of the martyrs on a cross, tied them to the cross, and then they had two samurai soldiers on either side with spears. And then they thrust the spears through their bodies this way and killed one by one the martyrs on the cross. And they thought they would get everybody's attention and bring them there to see these people being martyred as a way of discouraging the people from becoming Catholic. But they were so edified by the holy way these people died. They were singing and praying as they were being killed. And even St. Paul Miki was preaching to the Japanese and telling them that they must convert and become Catholic or they cannot save their souls. And so we celebrate their great witness. And you can see they have a monument there in Nagasaki on Nishizaka Hill. And they also have a museum there that is to the 26 martyrs and tells all the history of the persecution of the Catholic Church and the arrival of St. Francis Xavier in 1547, and through all the persecutions that the church underwent, even the hidden Christians. For 250 years, the church went underground because of the persecution. The only sacrament they could give to the faithful, because there were no priests in all of Japan, there wasn't a priest to give them confession or Holy Communion. The only sacrament they could administer was baptism. So they had a man in the village who was like considered like the leader of worship. He would keep track of the liturgical calendar and tell the hidden Christians what the feast days were. And another one would be in charge of baptizing the people when they were ready for baptism. So when a baby was born, they would take them out into the lake on a little boat where no one could see them, and they would baptize the babies or the adults out on the lake, and then come back to shore like they were just making a little trip, and they baptized the person out on the lake where they'd be have secrecy and no one would find out, because they were found out if they were Christian Catholics, they would be martyred or tortured and martyred. And they were very ingenious, the Catholics. There's a Buddhist image. It's called Kanon. It's a feminine deity in the Buddhist religion. It's a Buddhist-like woman with a child in her arms. And it's called, to the Buddhists, it's the deity Kanon, but the Japanese Catholics called it Maria Kanon. And they baptized that statue, you might say, and made it Our Lady and the Child Jesus. And they could have that statue in their homes openly, because people would think they were just Buddhists who had a devotion to Kanon. But that was their devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary, Maria Kanon, that they could do that and have devotion to Our Lady during the persecution. Because if you had a crucifix or a rosary, you would be arrested, and if you didn't apostatize by stepping on a crucifix or an image of Our Lady, they would martyr you. So this was a way they could practice their faith in secret and have devotion to Our Lady through this image of this Buddhist deity that they turned into Our Lady and the Child Jesus. So an old title of Our Lady in Japanese is Maria Kanon. It's spelled Kannon, Maria Kanon. And a man made a statue. The tallest wooden statue of Our Lady in the world is in the place in the Nagasaki prefecture, at a place called Hara Castle, where 30,000 Catholics were martyred by the samurai because they refused to give up their faith. This man started to build a statue out of wood. It took him 41 years to carve it, and he calls it Maria Kanon of Hara Castle. And he built the statue, or created the statue, of Mary and the Child Jesus in memory of these martyrs who died in the 1600s, who would not give up their faith, and eventually were slaughtered by the samurai. But you can see that. I'll send you a picture you can show the viewers of this big wooden statue of Our Lady. It's 10 meters high, so that's 32 and a half feet tall. It's made out of 5 pieces of wood that took him 41 years to carve. So that was one of the highlights, I think, of going to Japan, is to see this statue that this man, out of devotion to Our Lady and the martyrs, built there and constructed for for the faithful. But St. Paul Miki, as I said, was a Jesuit, and he was one of the first native clergy and native vocations to the religious life. He was not yet a priest, but he preached from the cross, as I said, to the Japanese before they killed him, and encouraging them for the faithful, not to deny their faith, and for those who were not Catholic, that they needed to become Catholic. And so we celebrate his great example. And also St. Lorenzo Ruiz, who is, for all those who are Filipino, that he was the first Filipino saint. He was martyred there in Nagasaki, and you can find his statue at the entrance of the 26 Martyrs shrine there in Nagasaki.
You are listening to the Rosary Hour podcast.
He, of course, was a Third Order Dominican, and he gave his life later on. His torture was different than the other martyrs. They hung him upside down in a pit. Usually in the pit was human waste and other things that was very gross. And then they would, all the blood would flow to your head, of course, being upside down. So they make a little slit in your forehead so that, it would be a slow death and torturous. And eventually he died in that terrible way, but he never denied his faith. And he is a great witness to that as well. So there's a lot of, this is the thing, when you go to Japan, you see a lot of this heroic martyrs, those who didn't deny their faith and remained steadfast. And then, of course, some who tried to hide and practice their faith in private. And as I said, for 250 years, many of them practiced their faith as best they could in hiding until finally the American Navy came there and kind of forced the Japanese to open themselves up to the West. For a while there, Japan had turned itself off from the West. They were afraid of the influence of the West, so they shut their borders to anything West, except for maybe a few trades that they did with the Dutch. And but finally, the Americans opened the borders again to trade in the late 1800s, 1850s or 1860. And the people, the Japanese allowed the Western traders, people who are coming to do trading, they allowed them to build chapels to their various Protestant and Catholic religion, but it wasn't open for the Japanese. They couldn't attend these churches. So a French priest named Father Petitjean, had prayed in France for the people in Japan, for the faithful. He knew they were under terrible persecution. So when he was finally sent to Japan, he built a church, the first church to be built in Japan when it was opened up to the Ora Cathedral. He was looking for the day when he might encounter some Catholics who were Japanese. So one day, as he was in the church, a woman came with about 5 or 6 other people into the church, and they were just looking around like they were just admiring the different things in the church. And they saw the priest, and the priest came up to them and greeted them, and they said, who's your authority that you follow? And he said, well, I follow a man called the Pope in Rome. And then they asked him, well, where's your wife? And he said, well, I don't have a wife. I'm celibate. And then they walked over. There's a statue, and that statue is still there in the side altar of Our Lady and the baby Jesus. And they said, who is that? Who is this? Pointing to Our Lady. He said, that's the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Mother of God. And that's when they asked 3 questions that they were always prepared to, in those 250 years, you might say they were waiting, and they were told that you'll recognize the true religion if you can find, first of all, that a priest who's not, the religious leader is celibate, not married, doesn't have a wife, that he obeys an authority that is a man in Rome called the Pope, and that they have special devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. So when he answered all three of those questions correctly, she said, "We are the same heart as you are." We are the same faith. And but even then, they were afraid to make themselves known, and eventually they also were persecuted.